It's also true that Trump exposed the other thing is the artifice behind so much of what happens in Washington. So,
Right.
like Nietzsche has this term, regulative fiction, he calls it or whatever, which is that the reality of all human affairs, especially at high levels and stuff, is like really messy. I mean, we're self-interested creatures and all these other things, and like all kinds of bad stuff happens behind the scenes. But we tell ourselves these grand narratives, these like regulative fictions, to like make sense of what's going on, right? So we feel good about being on the right side of history or whatever, and all this nonsense. And I think even before Trump, there was this big discordant thing happening where, partly a result of the technology of the information age, and but partly just simply because the general moral and actual talent decline of America's leadership class was getting to the point where these regulative fictions just couldn't be sustained anymore, and there was just all this discordance in voters' heads. And then Trump comes along and boom, just explodes it, like makes it like totally impossible to believe in these grand narratives about people in Washington know exactly what they're doing and exactly what they're saying, and we should just heed to their leadership. And boy, wow, the people that were the beneficiaries of that regulative fiction did not like that at all.
Yeah, I had Justin Amash on my show. He was a former Republican congressman from Michigan who left the Republican Party after turning on Trump, and became a libertarian. He retired from Congress. And the question I always ask people who are like high up in politics is, which is DC more like, Veep or House of Cards? And he had said, if I remember correctly, he said Veep, but he said the point people don't get is no one cares about policy. So like even on Veep, like she's fighting for filibuster reform or like, pre-K, public pre-K. He's like, they don't care. He's like, I would try to talk about these issues with like even Republicans, and it was just like talking to a wall.
Right. Yeah, well, yeah, I think that's a very astute observation, but I would also say, yeah, Veep is the answer, right? But at the same time, when something goes wrong on Veep, people laugh.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
When things go wrong in DC, and when someone laughs about oopsie, kids get droned. I
Yeah.
mean, that's where we're at with this, and that's just really sort of terrifying me. Like at the same time, I think, honest to God, maybe the single most damaging thing to American politics in the last 2 decades was the West Wing. And I'm like deadly serious about this. Like I arrived in DC in 1999, and oh my gosh, there was just like just hordes of like earnest liberals that like bought hook, line, and sinker into that show. And you want to talk about regulative fiction? Holy crap! The idea that this was all a bunch of just completely altruistic, humanistic Democrats running everything. I mean, the West Wing is basically to American politics what sort of pornography is to sex, essentially, in the sense that it completely leaves you with unrealistic expectations and real world disappointment if you believe that sort of narrative. And I think that it was it just there was this bill of goods sold to people in terms of what politics should be. And it's one thing if you're like if you're looking at that in historical terms and you're like elevating an Abraham Lincoln or a George Washington, right? But it's quite another thing when you're like spinning those narratives like as it happens, through an idealized version of the freaking Clinton White House, which is
Yeah.
what the West Wing was. And it's appalling to me that people ever got away with that. It's just appalling.